Good evening. Welcome to the Huntington and our 2025 Founders Day program, Sowing Community, Living with Octavia E. Butler's Parables. For those who are here for the first time, and maybe a few who aren't, I'm Karen Lawrence, president of the Huntington. Thank you. So in the early 1990s, I was teaching literature at the University of Utah and about to teach a course called The Experimental Novel. A colleague in my department, the English department, suggested I consider adding a novel he had just read by a writer I didn't know. Her name was Octavia E. Butler. The novel was Dawn. I read it. I was fascinated with her powerful imagination and the genre-bending, gender-bending, even species-bending originality of her storytelling. Of course, I included Dawn in my syllabus. So you can imagine how thrilled I was when I arrived at the Huntington 6 years ago and discovered that Octavia Butler, homegrown Pasadena writer and now world-renowned author, had entrusted her archive to the Huntington Library. To be exact, 398 boxes of note cards, loose leaves of paper, in spiral-bound notebooks of different sizes and shapes that she kept throughout her career, along with correspondence, manuscripts of her novels, including the two novels we'll discuss tonight together, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. Examples of Octavia's notes for these novels were cycling on the screen when you entered the auditorium. For a research library like the Huntington, this trove of materials was gold. But why tonight, you might ask, are we discussing Octavia's parables at our annual Founders Day event? After the devastating winds and fires that swept our communities in January, we modified our program this year to focus on Octavia's parables. Traditionally on Founders Day, we recognize the gift of Henry and Arabella Huntington, who 100 years ago entrusted their 200-acre private estate and its library, art, and gardens to the state and people of California, transforming it into a nonprofit institution that supports research, education, and, as they put it, the public welfare. Octavia's collection honors these values beautifully. You'll be interested to know that her archive is the collection most frequently requested by researchers coming to study in our rare book reading room at the Huntington. Highlights of her collection feature prominently in our public main exhibition hall, and they're in good company with the works of Shakespeare, Ben Franklin, and Thoreau, to name a few. For many months, our Huntington team had been planning to focus on the Octavia Butler collection. But after the events of January 2025, the team, led by Alice Tsai, Carla Nielsen, Monique Thomas, and Annabelle Adams, shifted our focus to the parables. Those of you in the audience who have read the novels know exactly why. 32 years ago, this is amazing, in 1993, Octavia wrote The Parable of the Sower, in which she imagined a dystopian future of climate catastrophe, including rampant fires, as well as economic and social upheaval that begin in 2024 and take place within a scorched Southern California landscape. Both novels, which are summarized in your program, are cautionary tales, and they are parables for our time. They're also a call for community building, a call we want to explore together with you tonight, both in our program and the reception which will follow. So in addition to changes in the focus of Founders Day, the coordinators have modified the format. After this program in the auditorium, we're hosting a reception in Haga Hall next door, featuring local vendors and small businesses from Altadena and Pasadena, and there'll be tables available for us to discuss the evening's program and how our community can remain strong and continue to recover. In a few moments, you'll hear short readings from Octavia's 2 novels. After that, the Huntington's Monique Thomas will take the stage and introduce the special guests we're hosting this evening, Nikki High, Tamisha A. Tyler, and John Williams from the Altadena community, all knowledgeable about the topic of community and Octavia Butler. Our thanks to them for participating and helping to shape the program. This event wouldn't have happened without the expertise of Carla Nielsen, curator of the Octavia Butler Archives, the great organizational work of Alice Sy, director of special projects, in tandem with Raylene Galarza, our partners in advancement, and Bon Appetit, our caterer, who provided catering space for local vendors and businesses. Finally, we're so glad they're here. Finally, I'm so pleased to recognize some special guests in the audience, the president and executors of the Octavia E. Butler estate. Yeah. Jules Jackson, director of the Octavia, I want to give you the full title, guys. Director of the Octavia E. Butler Estate and Octavia E. Butler Enterprises. Okay, now you can clap for this. And their guests in the audience, including Octavia's oldest living friend, Donna. Thanks, Jules, for bringing everybody together for this occasion, and we're so thrilled that you're here. Before proceeding with the program, we have a surprise guest in the audience who flew in for this event, Garrett Bradley, who's the writer and director of the film adaptation of Parable of the Sower, which is currently under development. And it's my pleasure to ask Garrett to come up. There you are. Okay. To ask Garrett to come up and say a few words. Garrett.
So I don't want to take up a lot of time. I'm going to be brief because we've got so much to do tonight that I think is going to be exactly what we need. So I just first want to say thank you to the Huntington, to Jules Jackson, to the estate, to Octavia for bringing us all together. It's a really powerful moment right now. Actually, everybody in this room, I mean, there's loved ones and people who have preserved and spent a huge amount of energy in making sure that all of us can understand what it is that Octavia has really left for us. And part of the challenge for each of us, not just myself, who's actively working with her material and has the honor to do that, but is to really try to understand what do we do with something that is no longer prophetic, but is now come to pass and be in this moment. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, well, what does a prophet do? I mean, how do they find their warnings? how do they get to the things that they need to say? And I've had the honor of being at the Huntington and being able to sort of reverse engineer what Octavia has left behind, which is her knowledge and her curiosity and her belief in herself and her belief in information being the thing that can help us get out of any situation, right? The world is not ending. Lauren, who is at the center of the parables, finds a way out of this, right? She's tested, she's put in a situation where she sort of, I would say maybe has that adolescent, anger of wanting to challenge what's around her, like all of us might have, but then she's really tested. Her own ideas are really tested. And she brings people into them by believing in herself and by paying attention. And that's what's so key, is all of us have the ability to pay attention to what's happening and to communicate with one another and to love one another. And it's all here. It's in the DNA of her work and in this room. So I can't believe that I have the honor right now of introducing the next very brief speaker, Mr. LeVar Burton. Thank you.
Octavia is smiling, y'all. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Octavia's words have inspired, uplifted, reminded, guided us for decades. One of the things that is really clear and apparent in Parable is the need for survival's sake to create community. Yes? This community, Pasadena, Altadena, the community that's been created this evening in this room, these are the seeds of our survival. Relish in the opportunity to be in community with one another. It is indeed the way forward. Have a good evening, y'all. Peace and blessings.
How can I say thank you enough for both of you being here and saying those words? And now, the words of Octavia E. Butler.
Sunday, August 15th, 2027. I think Travis Charles Douglas is my first convert. Zara Moss is my second. Zara has listened as the days passed, and as Travis and I went on arguing off and on. Sometimes she asked questions or pointed out what she saw as inconsistencies. After a while, she said, "I don't care about no outer space. You can keep that part of it. But if you want to put together some kind of community where people look out for each other and don't have to take being pushed around, I'm with you." I've been talking to Natividad. I don't want to live the way she had to. I don't want to live the way my mama had to either. Earthseed is being born right here on Highway 101. On that portion of 101 that was once El Camino Real, the royal highway of California's Spanish past. Now it's a highway, a river of the poor, a river flooding north. It might be possible to find such an isolated place along the coast and make a deal with the inhabitants. If there were a few more of us, and if we were better armed, we might provide security in exchange for living room. We might also provide education, plus reading and writing services to adult illiterates. There might be a market for that kind of thing. So many people, children and adults, are illiterate these days. We might be able to do it. Grow our own food, grow ourselves and our neighbors into something brand new, into Earthseed.
Memories of Other Worlds by Taylor Franklin Bancoli. I have read that the period of upheaval that journalists have begun to refer to as the apocalypse, or more commonly, more bitterly, the pox, lasted from 2015 through 2030, a decade and a half of chaos. This is untrue. The pox has been a much longer torment. It began well before 2015, perhaps even before the turn of the millennium. It has not ended. I have also read that the pox was caused by accidentally coinciding climatic, economic, and sociological crises. It would be more honest to say that the pox was caused by our own refusal to deal with obvious problems in those areas. We caused the problems. Then we sat and watched as they grew into crises. I have heard people deny this, but I was born in 1970. I have seen enough to know that it is true. I have watched education become more a privilege of the rich than the basic necessity that it must be if civilized society is to survive. I have watched as convenience, profit, and inertia excused greater and more dangerous environmental degradation. I have watched poverty, hunger, and disease become inevitable for more and more people.
Oh, those words. Good evening, everyone. My name is Monique Thomas, and it is my pleasure to be here tonight moderating this discussion, which centers the work and legacy of Octavia E. Butler and the Altadena and Pasadena community. Community is a word you're going to be hearing a lot tonight, so we'll come back to that. But next, I would like to introduce you to our panelists. We have Tamisha Tyler, Octavia E. Butler Scholar and Professor of Theology, Culture, and Theopoetics at Bethany Theological Seminary. John Williams, Executive Director of the Center for Restorative Justice. And Nikki High, owner of Octavia's Bookshelf, and yes. And our full bios are available in the program. So I would like to start, we've heard this word tonight and through the season, whatever, when we define season, that could be 10 years, 2 years, 2 months. But the word that I'm talking about is prophetic, and it's a word that is often associated with Octavia Butler and her work, and specifically at this time. So I wanted to start with the question of, if we could unpack, what is the prophetic? What are your thoughts on this?
I think there are a lot of different definitions that we utilize when we use prophetic. If you think that prophetic is a person who is claiming that they are the voice of God and they're speaking solely on behalf of God, then no, Octavia Butler doesn't fall into that category of prophetic. If you think that prophetic is only this sense of prediction, this will happen in 3 days' time, or this will happen in this time, then no, I don't think Octavia Butler falls into that sense of prophetic. But there is a difference between foretelling, prediction, and forthtelling, which is a sense of speaking truth to power. And I think that is where Butler is situated as prophetic. I think that this definition of prophetic as speaking truth to power is not only something that is true of Butler, but is true of different religious traditions. It's true of what something like Cornel West would say is a Black prophetic tradition. And that is the kind of prophetic that requires our attention. It requires our research, it requires us to understand what's going on in the world, and it requires us to make the kind of wisdom and decisions to say, if we continue in this vein, this is what we will end up with. And that is the way that I think Butler operates within a prophetic tradition.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't use the word prophetic either. I think for me, it's more pattern recognition. Where it was clear that she was an astute studier of history, and because she was able to stitch together what happened in 1619, what happened in 1776, what happened in 1865 and so forth, she was able to see patterns of racism, patterns of oppression, and patterns of abuse of power. And so by looking at that, she was able to take those things and pay close attention to what was happening at the time that she was writing these books. And then she was able to just think through and see all of these things and write what she wrote. And here we are in 2025, and it's like, oh, that seems prophetic.
Similar to my co-panelist, I struggle with the use of prophet or prophetic as it relates to Parable of the Sower, Talents, and Octavia Butler. I think sometimes when we do that, we reduce it to maybe a vision or some magical power, and that really takes away from how well studied and researched she was, how she analyzed topics of like climate change, which, that was in the early 80s before we were talking about climate change the way we do now. So it's really important to sort of, recognize her genius. She did not just wake up and make these predictions. She studied, she analyzed, she asked questions, she researched answers, and then she made this accurate prediction.
And I think it's interesting to state that she was very detailed in her research, the levels that she went to, which is incredible. And so that idea of forthtelling and paying attention makes a lot of sense when you look at the care and the work that she went into, what she was researching. I wanted to ask you all also, so you all engage with Butler's work in different ways. How did you first come across her writings, and how does it impact the work that you do today? And I'll start with John for this one.
I came to her writings late, like 2.5 years ago, as a historian, as someone who works here in the city, trying to get people to understand the racial history of our own city, our own town, and the naming of the school, the middle school being Octavia Butler. So it was late, but it was so impactful when I read it. I went back and read it again right away, and so because I knew I missed some things. But again, that pattern recognition in terms of what the work that I do just coincided really well with her work.
Well, I mean,
How does it fit into your life? How's her work?
I always like to reiterate, I am just a rabid fan, right, of Octavia. I love so much the work that Dr. Tyler does, and John, and so many other Octavia Butler scholars, and I engage with her work, from the perspective of a reader and someone who is just in such deep admiration for her writing ability, her writing styles, and who she was. I watch interviews with her over and over. I'm just fascinated, obviously, by Miss Butler. I have been engaging with her work for a really long time. I found kindred when I was about 16. So it's been a very long road. I think I'm just grateful that we didn't have social media back then, because I would be what I think they call a stan, or I do the work that I do today, obviously, because I love reading, but also I just struggle to understand people who say things like, I've never read a book by Octavia Butler, and I'm like, well, you know what, I can help you with that. And so it's just my dream to make sure that everyone engages in at least one of her books. And I'm just here to point you in the right direction, and really to discuss, how impactful her work was to me. And on a final note with that, I can just say, after reading books by Octavia Butler, it really did change what I expected out of sci-fi stories. I had never really seen myself represented in those stories, and so I thought I didn't like the books or the genre, and that's not true. I just wanted to know, hey, where are the Black and brown people 100 years from now? What did they do to us? And and she just made sure that she wrote us in.
I think kind of on that note, the fact that she centers not only Black, but Black women. You know, there's something about, and for me, that's always spoken to me because I also grew up as a little sci-fi kid, and I was in the Young Astronauts Club. I was that kid. And so I wanted to see myself. And so I just have so much appreciation. And then Tamisha also.
Oh, yeah. I, too, read Kindred. That was my gateway into Butler's world, and I thought this was amazing. I'm gonna read all of her work, and then of course life happened, and I didn't read all of her work. I was a doctoral student in seminary, and I was a constellation of frustrations. I couldn't reconcile the theology that I was learning, the brutalization of Black bodies, the justification based on the theologies that I was learning and all of the different things. And I took a break. I burned out. I took a break in the summer, and someone gave me a ticket to the exhibit here. And I went to the exhibit, and I was like, why did I stop reading Butler? And I was like, I'm gonna pick her back up. And I was like, what should I start with? And I look up, and there's this huge poster of Parable of the Sower. And I was like, I'll start there. I had no clue what I was gonna get into, but I didn't know. I was like, I'll just start there. And I read it, and I sat there and I said, where was this? This is the key for everything that I've been frustrated with. And I went back to my school. I said, have you read this? Has anybody read this? And it was the gateway to thinking about all of the different constellations of my work. I've learned so much from Butler's understanding of how humankind has used religion to evoke change in the world. And she doesn't say for good or bad, but she shows us so clearly the role that our belief plays in the worlds that we create and the way in which we act in those worlds. And that was the key for me and my work. And so it's gonna be me and Butler for a while.
And related to that, you all mentioned, so we are basically centering the Parables novels here today, but if there are folks who haven't read Butler at all and want to jump in, do you have recommendations for a book to start? Should they start with Parable of the Sower? Should they start with Dawn or Kindred?
Kindred. My suggestion is start with Kindred.
Okay.
I think it depends on what you like. If you like being scared to death, then start with Sower. If you're interested in interspecies, start with Dawn. If you're really interested in people with superpowers, and probably my second favorite series, Pattern Master is for you. Time travel, Kindred. You like vampires, Fledgling. There's something literally for everyone. So just, you won't go wrong. Just throw a dart at a list of the things, start there, it won't go wrong.
And I feel like there's a place in like Altadena, Pasadena where you might be able to buy some of.
I heard about that.
But we'll get to that later. Okay, go ahead.
So I'm gonna go a different route. I think start with the Parable along with looking at her, listening to her interviews. Because I think it brings a context in, so when you're reading those tough sections of the book, you can kind of go into her brain in terms of what she was thinking. So for me, that's where I would start.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. This next question, I'm going to start with Nikki, but I actually want to hear from everyone. So Butler provides an incredible example of world building. What is the importance of literature or the written word in world building and social activism? And I ask that specifically because we are in a time now, I love the actual real books, not so much books on listening to books or Kindle. I actually want to have the book. I want to bookmark. I want to smell the pages, all of that. And I think in some ways that gets lost. But there's something about an actual book. And so I wonder, in terms of literature and that as a format, what is its power or ability to really build worlds in terms of books and literature?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I'd like to say first and foremost, we are world building every day. Yes. Yeah. So the way you vote or not, the way you interact with marginalized people, the way you prioritize building community, those are all choices. You're building the world that you're in. So I think it's important to start there. What literature does, and sci-fi specifically, is it allows the writer, in my opinion, to create a world and create alternatives in this world so that you can actually see what equity might look like. You can see what a functioning society looks like, because sometimes we don't live in a functioning society. You can see things far beyond what we're living in right now. And if the writer does it really well, you can connect with it. And it will, in turn, hopefully, as you're metabolizing this new world that you're seeing or that you're reading about in a book, an Octavia Butler book, that you will start to ask yourself some questions about your role in world building, and to see every single decision you make as contributing to the world that you're living in. And maybe if we think about it that way, we can change it.
One thing I tell my students all the time, we world build a lot in my classes, is that words carry worlds. And I think that when you are reading and engaging, you are like creating these entry points of maybe a whole new world to you, a whole new language, a whole new set of rules and regulations. But hopefully what they do is they remind you of the ways in which your own words have power, the ways in which the spaces that you occupy is part of this contribution and is part of this community. I think that when we read things that we think are make-believe, it really gets at the question of what is truth. We think about, truth is, let's look at these facts, let's watch this documentary, let's, look at these data points, and those contribute to an aspect of truth. But how many of us have read Octavia Butler and walked away going, that was one of the truest things that I've ever encountered, and it is a work of fiction. And so I think that there is some ways that fiction, literature becomes a catalyst for truth to get at the crevices of our imagination that we often forget about when we're only fed facts. And I think that this is for all of the arts. Arts is the practice of our imagination, and we can't do anything we do without understanding how that works. So I think that if we want to know truly what is true, what it is true, that how we feel, and not just what we say, the histories of the words that we carry, then fiction and literature is a catalyst for us to practice and work those muscles.
I personally didn't seriously start thinking about world building until I started doing activist work, until I started doing anti-racism work. Because when you do that kind of work, when you're fighting so hard to create change, it is about world building. So I really relate to what you were saying, Nikki, that every single day we are building a world. But with that, we add imagination. And so the literature helps us to expand our minds, helps us to create worlds, and helps us to imagine far beyond what my finite thinking can be. And so again, I didn't start seriously thinking about world building until I started doing organizing and activism work.
I wanted to ask you all, just sort of speaking of world building and sort of embodiment, I'm thinking of the character of Lauren. And that it's a teenage girl. This is where we're viewing things. This is who Butler selected to take us into this, to be this agent of change. Why do you think, speculating, maybe that she made that choice, or why is that important? Do you think the story would have been different had it been a person in a different body than Lauren?
Oh, I'm already talking. I should probably hold the microphone. I'm like, oh, yeah, Monique, that's great. I forgot that you're... Yeah, that's great, yeah. Yes. I think this is why Butler specifically places Black women at the center of her stories, because there is something very important about what Black women do. Black girl magic isn't just a saying or a hashtag. It's a real it's a real thing, in case you didn't know. But I think it's important that Lauren is also young, because I don't know, honestly, I don't know if an adult came and said, I believe that things are changed. I don't know that I would believe an adult who has learned to take on the roles of life as who they are and forget to take it off. I think there's a certain aspect of imagination, of play, of creativity, of curiosity that a young person inhabits, that causes them to be open not only to the kinds of change that Lauren is open to, but to then be bold enough to go in her full teenage self, well, this is it. We all just need to go on and hop on. How many of us know teenagers, once they discover something, no telling them, they telling you, right? And so it just becomes believable that this young woman who has been shaped by her father, by her life, and by all these things is gonna say, oh, change, got it, okay, let's go. And I believe her. And so I think, who she is, her age, and her positioning as a Black woman is definitely important for the story.
I think Lauren could be nothing other than a teenage girl, Black girl specifically. And I think about Lauren a lot. I've been in multiple reading groups around Parable of the Sower, and some people have bravely told me that Lauren can be annoying, and I'm like, she's 15. Of course she's annoying. That's intentional, but I think it's that youth, right, allows you to have a freedom that you don't have once you have a family or you have dreams and goals, in your career or what have you. Only a 15-year-old Black girl can do what Lauren ultimately did. And so I can't really imagine that character being anything other than that. But I work with a lot of young people at my bookstore. That's intentional, because I'm really interested in young people. And I love the way that they're able to sort of take things that I didn't think to question, and not only do they question it, but they just blow it up, entirely. And for many of us, if you're a Gen X or above, I'm gonna say something really controversial, but thank a Gen X or a millennial or a Gen Zer, because it's because of them that we have work-life balance. That wasn't a thing when I was working. The idea that you stay at your job for 20, 30 years and then you retire, and they are like, I don't feel fulfilled, or I didn't, get the promotion in a year and a half, I'm out. I love that. So I am fascinated by young people and how committed they are to action and change, and Lauren exemplifies so much of that.
It had to be her. The book is about change, and what better representation of change do we have? A Black girl who's 15, who's grew up in a religious home, and just wanting to overturn all of those things. I mean, she became the perfect character to challenge the change that Butler was writing about, and I believe the change that she wanted to see in the world. And so it just had to be Lauren. And, it's just, I loved her bravado. I loved all of it. And I kept thinking, man, I wish I had that when I was 15. Wait, let me rephrase that. I wish I had that at 61.
There is something about this combination of innocence and audacity that I really love. So, yeah. Nikki, were you going to say something else?
No, I was just thinking about something my grandmother would say. She would say, the unmitigated gall. Yes. And I think about that with Lauren sometimes because she was so audacious.
Oh my gosh. Oops, use my mic. So we have talked about change, and all of you have hit on the fact that this book is centered around change, that the fact that this was the body, that this story, the representation makes sense because it was so tied to change. And so I want to read a quote. Change. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And so we're talking about sower and talents. What can both or either book teach us about embracing change?
Well, it starts with collapse. Like there's a collapse of a society, there's a collapse of all of these different things. And with any collapse, with any catastrophe, and we all have just experienced that last month or 2 months ago, there still is the hope of a new beginning. And with that hope of new beginning, it's going to be a change. And with that hope of a new beginning, we hope that things will be different, that we can work at or fix the things that we didn't like about what existed before the collapse, what existed before the catastrophe.
Yeah. And then just kind of that, I guess if there's a community in crisis, other things, if you all want to contribute, anything that you have to say about change and sort of with communities in crisis. And I feel like sometimes there's always a crisis. Some are worse, some are lighter, but there's always sort of something happening in our lives and our communities. What can these books sort of teach us about that?
For me, it's just the ability to pivot. It sort of teaches us that there's comfort in stability, but it's not lasting. Mm-hmm. And if you embrace, I think, sort of the idea of change, when you get used to pivoting, when you're watching the world collapse around you, or in many of our cases, for folks in the audience and here on the stage, burn, right before your eyes, you're forced to change. And there was something post-fire for me. So it's like, okay, so my morning routine is gone. I'm changing how I look at material possessions. My physical routine is different now. But look at this change that we created. This community who was in crisis, we all came together. Everybody, who were in these little tiny circles suddenly started to open them and embrace each other. And so I think there is something to be said about experiencing a crisis within a community that every single person in that community experienced at the exact same time. I mean, that change is dramatic, but there's no more comfort in stability, but there's comfort in change. And so I think a lot about the passage you just mentioned, like if you embrace change and you embrace it in such a way that you can almost celebrate it, it doesn't become scary anymore. And I find a lot of comfort that anytime I need to pivot or I need to change, I have a whole community surrounding me, doing it with me. That makes everything less scary.
I think it's interesting that we all talk about change. We've all experienced change, but we don't really talk about what to do when change occurs. And for something to be as consistent as change, you'd think we'd be better at it. We're not. And I think what's so interesting about Butler's work is even as we are experiencing change in their world, right? Because a lot of what we talked about tonight was Lauren in Sower, and not Lauren in Talents, which is a very different Lauren, right? A very different Lauren. And even as you are shifting from one novel to the next, you have to change your expectation about who Lauren is and what she chooses to do in the midst of her own change in her own world. And so I think Butler gives us a couple of things: community in change, practices of surviving and navigating change. But one thing that I think Butler does beautifully is she restores our agency back to us, because she says, all that you touch, you change. Like, change isn't something that happens to you. There's something you can do in the midst of that change. There's something you can offer to change, both in community, to yourself. And so I think she allows us to really sit and go, if change is inevitable, and if I'm always going to experience it, then what can I do to mitigate it? And she gives us tools. She says, kindness eases change. She says, partnership is life. She says, there is a phoenix that is in the ashes, right? And so there are these directions that point practically, making a go bag, being ready for change, but also ideologically in the way that we relate to one another. And so I think both of these books don't just tell us that change is happening, but it says you can do something about it.
That's great. When the wildfires happened in January, I was in one of the areas that wasn't really affected. We weren't evacuated, but we did have the ash and the smoke, and it's the closest I've ever been to my neighbors. So I have an upstairs neighbor, I have a neighbor down right next door, and we were sharing resources and there for one another. And it was one of those things that I hadn't thought about until we were imagining this event, of how we came together in community because we sort of had to. One other question about change, and I want to go into, remember that other word of partnership, because we'll be coming back to that one. What do you think, and maybe it's a combination, in terms of Lauren, the changes that we see from her from Sower, to Talents, what is that change? Where do we think, is that from what she's going through, what she's experiencing, age, both? Can we speak to her own change and journey?
That's a great question, as I'm having to prepare to teach Talents. She's older, obviously. She's had this experience of birthing Earthseed. They are Earthseed, they are acorn, they are in this space. They are not completely naive, not completely oblivious to what's happening in the world, but they have found a space. And then, I can't give spoilers, change. Change happens drastically. And she's having to make decisions now that she's had a taste of the thing that she was aspiring to. And so I think that there is more wisdom, but there's also tired, right? I don't want to say bitter, but I do want to say tired. And maybe there's a resolve in her that can be translated as bitter, but I think being a true realist, it is what it is, and she has to do what she needs to do. I think it's hard for us to encounter Lauren because we're reading Lauren not only through the eyes of Lauren, but through the eyes, spoiler alert, of her daughter and the relationship. So now you're reading another young Black girl who's reading the lens of Lauren as a young Black girl, trying to reconcile how this young Lauren became this woman that is her mother. And so I think that there is a lot of ways in which Lauren is still obviously true to Earthseed. She's looking at these aspects of change, but she is older and she has tasted the fact that it doesn't have to be this way. This community thing that I thought was true actually happen. Like, we can build this thing. And in many ways, she's having to start over. And so you're dealing with her going back to that toolbox of change in a new way that she probably didn't have to look at since she was a young teen. And sometimes it's hard to watch, but I think it's true. And I think that that's what makes Butler's writing so poignant and so necessary.
That really reminded me of what John said earlier, thank you, around activism and being, in racial justice, that when you said, what's your change, she's tired. When you engage in that work, and we've talked about world building as activism, I know in a previous conversation, I don't think we had it on the stage here, but we've talked about that. But there is that fatigue, I think, that comes with age, and also a sense of disillusionment that you don't have when you're 15, when you're starting in a movement. So thank you for that perspective as well. Now, coming to John, I wanted to ask you something specifically about community. So how do we build or rebuild community in partnership? There's a whole conversation about partnership. And actually, I should mention, there were questions that came in to us by folks that were going to be attending. And the second part of the question came from an attendee. What are some practical small steps one can take towards building a sense of community in an unfamiliar area? So they're new to the area, building community.
Yeah, there's at the center, we're constantly trying to build community. And so this is such a great question. And the only way that you can build community is through partnership. You cannot do it alone. We cannot be 100,000 silos. It doesn't work. And you live in your orbit, I live in my orbit. And so community is absolutely necessary. Partnership is necessary in that community and building community. And when we were talking about kind of bigger ideas last month when we were together, something you said, Nikki, has stuck with me since then, is that every community, in every good community, you have to be good at conflict resolution. Because with every community, there's going to be conflict. Within our own selves, we are conflicted without anyone else. And so developing those skills of conflict resolution, which takes deep listening. We have to learn how to listen to one another and not just hear the words, but actually try to put yourself in that other person or in other community members' position. If you don't listen, then there's not going to be a release of power. If we don't listen, there's not going to be the opportunity to make the change that Butler talks about. When she talks about God being changed, when she talks about everything that we touch, when we interact not just with people, interact with our environment, interact with everything that we can recognize through our being, the best way, the healthiest way for that to happen is through community. And so if we talk about the second part of your question about steps, one is active listening. The other is just making yourself available. Just showing up is a big, big part of community building, especially if you're coming into a situation where you're new. What's going on in the local community? How do people perceive things? How do those that I'm not engaging with interact with one another? How they interact again with the environment? And so active listening, showing up, sharing what you have, your talents, your time, your treasure, sharing those things also, all feed into and create seeds of change and seeds of a great community.
Wonderful. We just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask a question of you, John. I know that some folks have, actually both of you, I believe, some folks are in the process of reading Parable of Sower. Some folks have finished it and are going on to talents. Are there opportunities for reading groups or book groups?
Glad you asked.
Yes.
So I'm going to let Tamisha take it because she's the leader of this wonderful reading group, but go ahead.
Yes, so there are a couple of options for reading groups. Last summer, I partnered with the Center for Restorative Justice, and we did a slow communal reading of Parable of the Sower. It's a 5-week reading that is joined with questions, rituals, community practices over the course of, like I said, 5 weeks. We are doing that again with the local arts collective starting on the 31st. I believe there may be a spot or two available if you would like more information. But the Center for Restorative Justice and I will be continuing the summer reading group of Parable of the Talents for the month of July. 5 weeks, rituals. Some of the music you've heard before you came in was from the playlist, the soundtrack. And it'll just be a really great time. There'll be a Instagram or a website for if you're interested in signing up or hearing more.
Yeah, and I think I would just add very quickly, the slow reading is an embodied reading. When she talks about rituals, we're not just reading the text and coming in and talking about what we think about it. There's themes that we put together that Dr. Tamisha puts together, as she said, a playlist. It's truly a fully embodied experience, and we're looking forward to doing it again this summer in July.
One more plug. If you are interested in doing a 5-week reading and you can't come, Level Ground, we did create a publication of the reading for you to take and use in your community. Reach out to me afterward, and I can tell you more about that as well.
So I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for giving of your time. Thank all of you for being here this evening. And I feel like just from the readings that we heard and the conversation, there's certainly a lot to think about. As you notice, we don't have a Q&A. There are no mics set up in the back or anything, but that's because we want to encourage you to continue with conversation. So we are going to be headed over to Haga Hall for the reception. That's right after this. And what I want to encourage you to do is think of one seed, if you will, that you learned today, some idea, some concept that's really sticking with you, and hold on to that as you go into the reception. Also, meet one new person. Some of you have come with friends and other folks that you know, but there are a lot of us here, and there are a lot of folks that you haven't met. And part of what we talked about with community is that it doesn't happen unless we reach out, step out of our comfort zone, and meet new people. We are going to have questions at tables that are set up at the reception that are meant to start conversation, right? And so it's not just Earthseed. We're talking about seeds of conversation, right? And seeds of community. So we want to invite you to engage in that next door and to mix it up and meet some people that you don't know. The other thing is that Nikki High has a pop-up bookstore in Haga. And yes. So if you haven't made it up to the store, there are books here, and we don't want Nikki to leave with any books tonight, right? So please enjoy in that. So thank you again, everyone, for being here tonight, and we will see you at the reception.